for alleged sexual harassment by a have you ever tried to have sex before?
Told by the UN Integrity Unit that they could not deserve the punishment imposed on the offender.
Hi, good evening everyone. So thank you for joining our live today, and I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar. My name is Li Xing, the Youth Chairperson of Federation of Reproductive Health Association Malaysia, and I will be your moderator for today. So the topic for the day is Sexual Harassment Law, what's going on. So this webinar is a part of a series where we will be discussing on key issues related to sexual and reproductive health and rights, SRHR in short. So don't forget to like and share live kita pada hari ini dengan keluarga dan rakan-rakan untuk kita sama-sama bincang tentang isu ini. Anda juga boleh check out our past webinars on sexual harassment in schools and teenage pregnancy on FRHAM Facebook and YouTube channel. So our discussion today will be focusing on sexual harassment law. I'm sure we have seen and heard news about sexual harassment that left us wondering what's happening. Dan isu-isu ini bukan isu baru dalam masyarakat kita hari ini, tetapi telah lama wujud dan seharusnya kita bincangkan bagi memastikan ia tidak lagi berlanjut dan ke seterusnya. Dan webinar hari ini special sikit because we are collaborating with Association of Women Lawyers, AWL, a group of women lawyers that are dedicated in advocating full enjoyment of all rights of women based on principles of substantive equality. So today, I'm so honored to be given this opportunity to hear from the brilliant minds of our two speakers, and I would like to introduce our first speaker of the day, Ms. Mira Samantha, a feminist activist, a proud vocal advocate, and a well-known person in the discussion field of gender equality issues. So she was the former president of the Women's Aid Organization and also the Association of Women Lawyers, and she presently serves on the AWL Executive Committee, which tackle issues concerning on workplace discrimination and sexual harassment. And Mira also sits on an International Advisory Council of the Coalition of Sexual and Bodily Rights that brings people together from Asia-Pacific region to discuss, strategize, and lobby on issues pertaining to autonomy of women's bodily rights. So, before we begin the session, let us watch a short video on the case that happened in real life.
Dulu, saya bekerja di sebuah institusi kewangan di Kuala Lumpur. Pada peringkat awal pekerjaan, saya berkawan rapat dengan rakan sekerja dari kumpulan lantikan yang sama dan usia yang sebaya. Kami terdiri daripada 4 orang, 2 lelaki dan 2 perempuan, dan kami sentiasa bersama di waktu bekerja ataupun selepas waktu bekerja. Genap setahun bekerja, salah seorang daripada kami iaitu kawan lelaki telah dinaikkan pangkat. Saya gembira untuk dia dan dia menjadi orang atasan saya. Bidang kerja kami amat padat dan sibuk. Kami selalu bekerja bersama, baik di pejabat atau bekerja di luar kawasan. Oleh kerana kami telah bekerja bersama dalam satu tempoh yang panjang, kami telah mengenali satu sama lain, luar dan dalam. Saya menganggap dia sebagai kawan baik. Dia adalah teman rapat saya juga, tapi itu saja, tak lebih daripada itu. Dia pernah beritahu saya, dia menganggap saya sebagai teman istimewa dia. Dan pernah juga beberapa kali, dia berkata ingin memperisterikan saya. Saya ketawa, kerana saya menganggap dia bergurau. Tapi, semakin lama saya perasan, perangai dia agak berubah. Dia suka mendesak, mengongkong saya. Dia pernah cuba untuk pegang tangan dan pinggang saya. Dan kadang-kadang, dia buat cerita. Kata ada mesyuarat di sekian-sekian tempat. Bila saya sampai, dia kata mesyuarat itu batal. Saya suka kerja saya, lagi-lagi zaman sekarang. Bukan senang nak dapat kerja. Tapi sekarang, secara jujurlah, saya memang tidak selesa dengan dia. Kadang-kadang dalam pejabat pun dia cuba pegang-pegang saya. Bisik rapat-rapat dekat telinga saya. Hampir nak tercium pun adalah. Saya pernah beritahu dia, saya tidak selesa dengan apa yang dia buat pada saya. Tapi dia ketawa dan dia buat lagi dan lagi dan lagi. Saya pernah minta bantuan dengan rakan-rakan lain. Tapi mereka cakap saya je yang perasan lebih. Saya berimajinasi tinggi. Akhirnya masih tiada jalan penyelesaian. Selama 6 bulan saya cuba untuk selesaikan masalah ini. Saya cuba bercakap, berbincang dengan dia. Semua tak jalan. Saya cuba jauhkan diri dari dia. Memang tak boleh lah sebab dia pengurus saya. Saya cuba minta tukar jabatan, dia tak luluskan pula. Saya dah cuba macam-macam. 6 bulan saya hidup tertekan dan akhirnya masalah saya selesai. Saya letak jawatan dan kini saya bekerja di tempat lain.
So now I would like to invite Mira here.
Hi.
Hi, Mira. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Yeah, so we have watched the short video. So this is a story of a victim who shares the experiences she encountered in the workplace and ultimately quitting her job to escape from this condition. Imagine how terrified, upset, and helpless the victim will be, because when she tells a friend about her story, they tend to believe that she's just being overthinking, and there is actually no one there to support her. So in this case of sexual harassment, I wonder what can we do? And I also like to invite Mira to share with us on what is sexual harassment and how long has AWL been working on advocating women's rights. But before I pass the floor to you, I would like to inform everyone that we will have a Q&A section after this. So if you have any question you would like to ask our panel, you can just leave your question on the chat box below, whether you are watching on Facebook or YouTube. And I would like to pass the floor to you now, Mira.
Hi, thank you. So before I talk about the journey that the women's groups have gone through to lobby for sexual harassment legislation, perhaps I just briefly discuss what is sexual harassment. As we know, sexual harassment is very much rooted in power imbalance, and it exists in the patriarchal culture that permeates through the private sector and the public sector in our society and in many societies. So what is actually sexual harassment? I mean, we know it affects men, women, and even trans persons. So what is it? It is an unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that affects a person's dignity, and it also can create an intimidating environment, an offensive environment. So basically, there are 3 elements to it that you have to look out for. Is it sexual? It's an unwanted conduct? Is it sexual in nature? And the impact on the recipient, on the person receiving the harassment, that causes a negative impact personally. It can also cause a negative impact if you're in a workplace, like the video that we just saw, or if you're in a school environment or a university environment, it can impact your studies, the environment there. So for example, when a person makes a sexual joke, okay, some of us might feel offended by it, and some may not. Those who don't feel offended by a sexual joke will say, there he goes again. But to me, it may offend me, and I don't like it. It affects me. So it's very much subjective. It's like in the video that we saw, some of her friends said, no, you're making something big out of it. It's nothing. It's you're imagining things. So, but for her, it was real because it was directed at her. For example, the touching and wanting her to be his wife, that would be, she felt uncomfortable. So there were very much elements of sexual harassment there. And there are different types of sexual harassment. In the video, there was touching, and he wanted to kiss her, or he tried to kiss her. And so that is physical, touching, kissing. There's verbal harassment, such as making sexual jokes, innuendos, and in this case, he wanted her to be his wife. Gestural, for example, leering, ogling, showing rude signs. Visual, that could be showing pornographic material. Psychological, unwanted social invitations, like in the back to the audio, the video again, where he wanted her to be his wife, and it was an unwanted invitation. It affected her. So it caused a bit of trauma for her that she couldn't even work. It impacted her environment, working environment, and sadly, she had no choice. She felt she had no choice, but she had to leave the workplace. So that is just what is sexual harassment. So back to your question about, Lizine, about when did we start pushing for sexual harassment legislation? Well, it started sometime in the 90s when the women's groups in Malaysia, and together with the women's section of the trade unions, have been long time lobbying for sexual harassment. It was in the 90s that we saw the acceleration of women lobbying for policy change, mind you. There was a move away from just activist-oriented approach. In the 80s, that's how they started, into policy advocacy approach, giving voice in the area of governance and policies. So the women's groups felt it was critical to be represented in the emerging issues that was at that time, emerging issues of globalization, development strategies, in the area of religious practices, and in matters that affected women's health, women's sexuality. So these were the critical areas that were emerging at that time. So in the 90s, that's how Women's Agenda for Change came about. Women's Agenda for Change, which was spearheaded by Women's Development Collective, which was a women's organization at that time in the 90s, which was part of JAG, which was a smaller group of women's organizations. And JAG is a coalition of 13 or 14 women's organizations now, and AWL is part of them. And at that time, in the 90s, there was only about 5 or 6, if I remember. So Women's Agenda for Change is a document. Actually, it was a booklet. It had 11-point agenda, and this booklet was used as a lobbying tool for general elections, because general elections was coming up during that time. So we wanted to push forward our agenda, the women's agenda. It's like a women's manifesto, And AWL was part of this movement and was involved in this women's agenda. And one of the agendas, the critical issues, one of the agendas in the 11-point agenda was included violence against women at work, which addressed sexual harassment at that time. So that was the start of it in the 90s. And then there was a Beijing Platform for Action. That was a resolution that was adopted by United Nations at the 4th Women's Conference. And it adopted a set of principles concerning equality between men and women. And there were 12 critical areas, and one of the areas was violence against women. So at this Beijing Platform Action in the UN, it noted that was in 1995. sexual harassment as a form of violence against women. And it called all member states to take measures to actively combat this act of violence. So that was the starting point of also internationally addressing sexual harassment as a form of violence against women. Then the legal approaches that were adapted later was, of course, the Code of Practice. In 1999, on the Code of Practice on the I have to sometimes I forget the full name, the Code of Practice on the Prevention and Eradication of Sexual Harassment. And that was introduced in 1999. It's a self-regulatory code. So basically, it was the first definitive official document by the government to address the problem of sexual harassment. But because the code was voluntary, it had no power of enforcement. So it really didn't work well because very few corporations adopted this code. Then we have in 2001, the women's groups got together and drafted the first sexual harassment bill. I was involved with this drafting in 2001, but it was spearheaded by Zarizana Abdul Aziz from Women's Development Collective from Women's Center for Change, in Penang. So she spearheaded it, and the JAG group, there were about 6 or 7 organizations at that time that involved in the drafting, and AWL and Women's Aid Organization were all involved in the drafting. So we nearly, that bill that we presented to the Ministry of Human Resources and Ministry of Women and Family Community Development. At that time, the minister was Dato' Sharizad. She was very keen she was really pushing for lobbying for this bill, even wanted it to go as far as the cabinet. But there was a very strong lobby group that was against it, and that was the Malaysian Employers Federation. They were not keen for several reasons, and one of the reasons was that it was too expensive to set up the mechanism in place, and also the whole issue of vicarious liability, where employers were held responsible for the actions of the employees. So for those reasons, we lost our efforts all the way up nearly to cabinet, and we lost the bill then, unfortunately. Then in 2005 was the PSD, the Public Service Department, that was introduced as a general circular, which had the same features of the code, but only it was enhanced by a provision of counseling to the survivor. Again, this code, this general order, was only available to government servants. But many of the government servants were not aware of the existence of it. It was not publicized that well. And many of them were not confident to use it because, they didn't have much faith. And also they were afraid of reprisals within the government departments. Then came what you call the Shout campaign, which was basically SH out. If you read it out, it says Shout campaign. And that was in 2011. And that was spearheaded by FRHAM at that time. It was a campaign it was a national campaign focusing on eradicating sexual harassment. So it was basically raising awareness about it. Then came the Employment Act. The Employment Act 1955 was amended to include sexual harassment. but it did not cover East Malaysia. And also, what it lacked was in the area that the regulations on redress mechanism, it was not stringent enough. And complainants were not confident on the complaints process because it was at work, and especially if your boss was your harasser. And they feared also victimization. So it was not something many people wanted to use. Then came the tort of sexual harassment. The famous case in 2017, the Muhammad Rizwan Abdul Razak versus Asma Haji Muhammad. This was the first time the use of civil law, tort of sexual harassment, was introduced. And it was successful in civil court to address sexual harassment. It's a new avenue of redress. So it was never used before. So this was the first time. So this area is still new. It's not been tested out in other cases. So we are waiting for other cases to come to court. But the only thing about this is you need a lawyer. And to get a lawyer, it can be expensive. Then came the penal code, provisions on outraging or insulting modesty. It was under section 354 and 509 of the penal code. And again, you have to lodge a police report. And let's not forget, the burden of proof here is beyond reasonable doubt. So it makes it very difficult for victims to successfully bring this matter to court because the evidence that you have has to be very stringent. And as we know, most of the cases in sexual harassment are basically invisible assault that many people don't see it. And so the proving evidence is very difficult at all times. Then lastly came the sexual harassment draft again, which we redrafted a bits of it, the one that 2001. So in 2017, our next speaker, Danny, she was also with me in drafting the second time round, the Sexual Harassment Bill 2017. And this draft bill included a bit more than it included issues on online harassment. Because in 2001, that was online media harassment, cyberbullying was not an issue. I mean, we didn't have those kind of harassment issues at that point in time. So these were new emerging issues that we added on in 2017, and Danny will talk a bit more about it. And the government at that time, the old government, set up a sexual harassment task force, and it was set up, which included agencies from Bayu, the police and academics were involved. It was a small group, and I think Danny has been involved in this, and perhaps she may tell a bit about it, but it was still on discussion stage and amending the act, and a bit of the Jack bill was used as as the benchmark for their discussions. So that's where we are. On our journey on sexual harassment legislation, but yet, as you know, from the 90s till now, we're still talking about it, and we don't have a standalone sexual harassment legislation. Thank you, Lizzie.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing with us on how LBL has been working so hard fighting for women's rights and drafting all the sexual harassment legislation. And I also totally agree with you that sexual harassment is not just simply an expression of maybe sexual desire, but it is also an expression of aggression, unwanted conduct, or any unwanted behavior, because the act performed is intentionally without the other person's consent. Yeah. And so everyone, remember, no one has the right to sexually harass or bully anyone else. So no matter what. Yeah. And thank you so much, Mira, for sharing with us. Yeah. So, jadi tadi kita telah dengarkan sharing daripada Mira dan kita akan ada sesi soal jawab bersama dengan panel-panel kita. Jadi jika anda ada sebarang soalan, anda boleh ajukan di chat box live ini ataupun dekat YouTube. Dan di sesi soal jawab, kita akan ajukan soalan anda. And now I would like to introduce the Vice President of AWL, Daniela Zulkifli. So Dani is an amazing young lawyer who focuses her passion on issues relating to sexual harassment, child abuse, and sexual reproductive health and rights. So she was also part of the team that drafted the Sexual Offenses Against Children Act and Sexual Harassment Bill and was now a steering committee member working on a project advocating for gender equality amongst law students. So today, Danny will be sharing with us on why do we need sexual harassment legislation. And without further ado, I would like to invite Danny to continue the session. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Reason. And thank you, FRHAM, again for inviting us and working together with us on this webinar. I think there are a few things here, right? So when there's a lot of talk about having a standalone sexual harassment bill, and I think there's a bit of a misconception when people say, oh, we don't have existing law. If we say that it's non-existent, it's not correct, because there are laws currently today that deal with sexual harassment. The problem with that is that there are certain gaps in the current framework, and you need to fulfill certain criteria in order to avail of the different avenues or the different remedies that you can take as a complainant. So maybe I can just start with just sharing with you what the current legal framework is, right? Okay, sorry. Maybe Sharmila, you can help share the slides. Right, so while we go into that, right, so roughly there are about 5 different ways that we can take, or 5 different ways that you can actually, or a complainant can take when it comes to sexual harassment, right? One is the criminal, the criminal route. The second is the civil, or going to a civil court, and the third is into under the Employment Act, and that has to be in the context of, like, let's say maybe you're an employer or employee. The fourth one is in a circular that is provided for public service, and the fifth one is like an in-house mechanism. So when it comes to these, right, when you want to lodge a complaint, for example, so there are a few things that you can do. One is, and the most common thing that people will tell you is that to go and lodge a police report. And how you do that is that you when you go to the police station, you need to lay out, what are the facts, what happened, what incident happened, and you need to be as specific as possible about how the incident occurred, who did it involve, were there other people, when the incident happened, and all these will have to be laid out in a police report. After that, you will go through an investigation process. And in that investigation process, you will then have to basically answer certain questions that the investigating officer will ask you. And then afterwards, when the investigation process has completed, then That will then be forwarded to the Attorney General's chambers, and then they will decide whether or not to prosecute the case. Now, once you have done that, right? I think it's fine. I think we don't need the slides anymore. So once the case is then prosecuted, right, and it goes to court, a few things are going to happen. Number one, you are going to become a witness in the case. So you are not actually a party. It's actually a case between the state and the accused. So whoever the alleged perpetrator is will become the accused, and you will become the main witness in the case, and you will then provide evidence in order to assist or facilitate the prosecution to prove the case against the accused. Now, there are a few limitations here, or a few gaps. Number one is that because you're a witness in the case, you are not a party and therefore is not entitled to any remedy. It's very rare that we see that a complainant gets like compensation, for example. So in most of the cases that we see, and especially when it comes to sexual harassment related offences, the outcome of the case is that the accused either, goes to jail or is imprisoned or gets fined. That is if that person is convicted. If not, then the accused will be acquitted, right? So there's a bit of a limitation when it comes to what sort of remedy that you can get as a complainant. Secondly, there's a higher standard of proof. Now, the reason behind this is because a criminal case is penal in nature, as in it is actually meant to punish and also to basically to prevent future crimes, right? So the severity level is much higher than, like, let's say, a wrongdoing or like someone joking and a less severe form of sexual harassment. So because of this higher standard of proof, it becomes a lot harder to bring your case against the accused, and especially because there's usually very little physical evidence, and especially if it's something that was said, for example, then it's going to be very hard to prove. There are also certain limitations when it comes to, let's say, that you need to prove the intention of the accused. So this is what the prosecution will try to do, right, in the course of the case. So that's as far as the criminal action is concerned. You also have, like what Mira was telling just now, is on civil case, right? And in order to do that, then you need to basically file a civil action in court, which, as Mira said, will actually require you to hire a lawyer to then argue the case for you, prepare the necessary paperwork, and basically take the case through trial, if that happens. And that can actually be time consuming, and also will will result in you incurring certain costs. The thought of sexual harassment is also relatively still new, because it was only introduced sometime in 2016 in the federal court. So that is something that we have yet to see, really develop as far as our laws are concerned. The third option is under the Employment Act now. So Part 15A of the Employment Act provides for sexual harassment definition and what happens when a complainant goes to the employer to lodge a complaint. Now, under the Employment Act, the employer is obliged to inquire into the complaint, and if they refuse, then they need to justify why they refused it. Like, for example, maybe they have done an inquiry before and they found that there was no sexual harassment in that case, or they think that the complaint is frivolous or doesn't have a basis, so to speak. The complainant can also lodge a complaint to the Director General of Labour directly, in which case then, the Director General will then be able to investigate the case. And there are certain consequences if the alleged perpetrator is found liable or have actually committed sexual harassment. Now, the limitation here is that this needs to be in the context of an employer-employee relationship, and not everyone or not all instances of sexual harassment fall into that sort of situation. The fourth way of doing it is actually going through, if you're a public servant, then there is a circular on public service that deals with sexual harassment. Now, this actually provides for the procedures. It also tells you examples of sexual harassment. What is the definition of sexual harassment? It's quite wide, and there are a few categories. And how is a complaint then dealt with? But the limitation there is that you need to be in public service. And another one is your in-house mechanism, meaning if you are working in an organization or if you're volunteering, for example, or even if you're like a guest at a hotel, or if you're a student at the school, for example, then that institution that you are in may have its own in-house mechanism. So organizations or institutions can adopt the Code of Practice on Prevention and Eradication of Sexual Harassment, the one that Mira was mentioning earlier. But unfortunately, that's not mandatory. So what that means is that not all institutions have that, and it's not mandated by law, you see. So in some of these situations, so you need to first fulfill these conditions, right? You need to be, either in an employee-employee sort of context. You need to be in an organization which has an in-house mechanism, or you need to go through the criminal action avenue, or you need to hire a lawyer and then file your paperwork and all that to go to court. So because of all these, right, we see that some people, well, actually a lot of people have trouble trying to basically gain access to justice and to bring in their case, because number one, people are not really aware, where can I go, what can I do? Secondly, sometimes options are a bit limited because you need to know where to go, right? And if, let's say, you are not an employee in an organization, there's only 2 or 3 other options that you can take. And there are certain limitations also when it comes to like the time and the cost. And on top of that, also there's a bit of an issue with enforcement as well, because sometimes people who are taking your complaint, for example, are not sensitized enough to understand the dynamics of of sexual harassment and to be able to deal with the trauma that a complainant is dealing with. And so what we've done is that we have looked into these gaps in the current legal framework. We've also looked at certain we've also sort of looked into all of the existing laws and sexual harassment. We're trying to like pull them together and try to improve it. We also looked at laws from other jurisdictions as well. So we looked at the UK, we looked at Australia, we looked at the US, Singapore, and many other countries. And then we sort of, we did some case studies and some learnings to pick up, what it is that we need to do here. So as a result, we are saying from Jack is basically that we need a standalone sexual harassment bill that will actually complement but not replace existing law, so that it adds on to the sort of avenue that someone can take. And there are 5 key characteristics under this new bill that we're proposing. The first one is that we want to widen coverage of sexual harassment and like who can actually lodge complaint and all that. And how we do this is to define sexual harassment or to improve the definition of sexual harassment, rather, to include any form of sexual harassment. So it can be verbal, it can be physical, it can be gestural, it can also be visual, it can also be something that is virtual, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be physical, like, but it can also be virtual as well. Secondly, that the coverage is not limited to certain contexts. So you don't have to be an employee in an organization, you don't have to be an employer, you don't have to be a public servant, you don't have to be a member of a certain organization, for example. But you can be anyone, and that includes that includes citizens and non-citizens as well, or even stateless persons. And that's what we want from the bill, so that anyone can actually access. Now, the third thing, under this coverage issue is that when we look at sexual harassment, it can also cover not just one event, but also a series of events. Because sometimes sexual harassment doesn't just happen once, but it can happen through a course of events, through a period of time. So, for example, like the case, the audio that we've heard just now, the survivor had actually, not only was she harassed in terms of, the alleged perpetrator telling her that he wanted to make her his wife, but also that he tried to kiss her on some occasion, and then he tried to get close to her, and these are a series of activities that amount to sexual harassment as well. So that's as far as coverage is concerned and definition. The second portion is to establish a tribunal. Why do we want a tribunal? So the reason for this is that, a specialized tribunal would provide for a more expedient and convenient process. So when it comes to like courts, for example, you need to hire legal counsel, you need to file in paperwork, you need to put in your pleadings, your statement of claim, your defense if you're on the other side, and you need to then prepare your case, so on and so forth. Now, with the tribunal, what we are proposing is that it should mirror, some of our existing tribunals in Malaysia as well. And so, you only need to pay an administration fee. So it's a lot cheaper in that sense. And that it's a lot more accessible. So anyone can go, you don't need, and you don't actually have to hire legal counsel. And the members of the tribunal, as in the judges who sit on the tribunal, should consist of people who have experience dealing with sexual harassment issues. So that's a key ask that we want from the bill. The third thing that we want from the bill is that it will improve access to justice. And how we do this is that, number one, cases are dealt with in private. So every case that comes to the tribunal, for example, will be dealt with in private. It's not open for public hearing, and the processes have defined timelines, and that it's not costly. And it's not supposed to be rigid in the sense that, like, okay, you must follow this, and that, and, file in your papers by certain days and put in so-and-so details. What we're interested in is actually the substance and eventually justice in the matter. The fourth thing, or the fourth ask that we have, is that there is mandated protection. And what this means is that we want public and private actors to have to take proactive measures to combat sexual harassment. And that means that, institutions like schools, for example, or like public transportation, or even companies, or even, malls, or wherever it is that you go to, have a positive duty, as in they must maintain and ensure a safe environment. And this can be done through having a policy and having a mechanism and establishing a culture that is safe and free from sexual harassment. And the fifth, or the last, among other things, is that we want improved remedies. So remember how I said, in certain let's say if you go to court and you take the criminal route, there's not much remedy that you can ask for. So what we are asking for is that complainants should be able to seek different types of remedies, and this doesn't just cover monetary remedies but also non-monetary remedies. And so that could be compensation, that could be injunction type orders, it can be an apology, it can be counseling even. So this is something that is quite unique that we've not really seen in any other legislation. So these are some of the things that we are asking for, when it comes to the new sexual harassment bill. And we really hope that with this bill, it will actually, allow more people to be able to speak up and lodge their complaints and have their case be heard and actually finally have it resolved, right? So that this is our big hope for the bill. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Danny, for sharing with us on sexual harassment legislation. So we can see how important is the legislation, because it provides guidelines for people to handle sexual harassment cases accordingly. So thank you so much for that. So I would like to invite Mira back to the stage, because I have a question for Mira. Yeah, hi. Yeah. So I was wondering why do young people nowadays they prefer to share their experiences on social media rather than filing a formal complaint to the authorities?
Yeah, it's a good question because, as a victim who goes through any form of sexual harassment, they go through a variety of emotions, sometimes they feel traumatized, humiliated, feel angry. And yet, despite all these challenges, many do choose social media, and you wonder why they don't go through the legal process. Is it because they don't trust the legal process? Or if you're in an organization, there is no legal there's no reporting mechanism. And even if there is, they don't trust the internal process, the mechanism in place, or that they find that the culture that the place where they are is toxic in nature. So some of them do resort to social media because I guess they find comfort in airing out their grievances, and they can find comfort from strangers who may have experienced similar incidents. So they get some solace and support and find a support network. And with that network, they become a bit more empowered. So is this the best way? I'm not sure. But there are cases of recently, you would have heard of Ayn, where rape jokes were made and she took to social media, although there were backlashes, but she made an impact. And even this girl, Cindy Ong, the swimmer, the national swimmer, she didn't take it online, but she made a media statement. There were backlashes, but it was an opening for people in the sports industry to share their experiences of sexual harassment. I think the Me Too movement has also given courage to a lot of young, to many survivors, not just young, to many survivors to speak out. So I guess I just want to share one case that had a successful event, where the case of, in Singapore, the NUS case of Monica Bay, where she took to social media to speak out on online harassment when a fellow student photographed her while she was having a shower in university. She lodged a report. There was a lot of, and she took it to social media. She received backlash, and so did the perpetrator, mind you. But what was very interesting about her was she pushed the discussion on how do we improve the system, rather than discussing, what shall we do with this perpetrator? And I think that was a very good strategy. because that helped form a discussion group amongst the university students. And the university students held a town hall meeting, and they spoke about the lack of victim support within the university, and there's a lack of communication between the university and the students. So what the university did in the end was they set up a unit to support victims of sexual harassment. And mind you, that spurred other Singapore universities to rethink about their sexual harassment policy. In fact, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore introduced an anti-harassment online module, and this was drafted by the students and lecturers on what constitutes harassment and what are the support resources available, and to raise awareness on how to deal with in such situations so that they have a safe and conducive environment. So that's the plus point. But of course, we know of many cases where many have suffered cyberbullying, harassment online, and sometimes the social media becomes a platform of a judge and jury. There's a trial by media. So there's a lot of personal cost element involved. You run your risk of your life being examined online, and especially if people who don't know anything about your case, it is amplified. And if your family doesn't know at all, okay, that's another burden. That's another challenge that you have to go through. And then you might get negative comments, threats, verbal, blaming victims, and then you tend to feel there's a sort of a victim blaming. Questions are posed to you. Why did you dress that way? Well, why did you say it? Why did you speak in that manner? So there's a sort of a secondary trauma that you go through. So whatever you even post online, people can take snapshots of it and they could share it on different platforms. So, we've got to be very careful what we say in particular. And I think the most important thing is never name the alleged perpetrator. Never do that. That's a mistake. Because if you do that, you are calling out for, because it's calling out for a case of criminal defamation. So you've got to be very careful what you say if you do go. I urge you, if you ever intend to, please speak to a lawyer before you even mount your redress on social media. Or speak to a friend, a counselor first. Because whatever you put on social media, you have no control over it. It just goes haywire, and then you can't stop it. Unless, like Ayn, she had a lot of backlash, but she had a support network of her family behind her. And of course, she galvanized a whole group of people, students and all. So you've got to be very strong if there was any backlash on you. So that's why I think people there's pros and cons to it, going on social media, but I urge you to be very careful.
Yeah, thank you so much for the sharing. So since I were running out of time a little bit, so we just invite Danny back to the stage. Yeah. Okay, so here's a question for you. So sometimes when the sexual harassment happens, so people may be taking side. So instead of supporting the victims, they tend to do victims blaming by judging their appearance or their outfit by saying that, oh, this person is wearing too little or too sexy. So what do you think about that?
Thank you. I think, I suppose, people have been talking about this, and I think I just want to emphasize, right, that the complainant is never asking for it, right? There's no such thing as I want to be sexually harassed, right? Like what Mira said earlier, there's an element of unwanted conduct of a sexual nature here. So, and see, sexual harassment, as with any other sexual offenses or sexual crimes or sexual wrongdoings, actually, is about power dynamics, right? It's about exerting power over someone, and making that someone feel humiliated or degraded, or feel fear sometimes even. And it's really not about what you can do to prevent sexual harassment, because you can't, right? It's not for the survivor to think, okay, how do I avoid myself from being sexually harassed today? Sure, you can be educated about it, you can understand what sexual harassment is, you can sort of empower yourself with knowledge and learn how to say no and to react. Maybe truth is, when it happens, it's not so easy, and it is not for the survivor, or the potential victim, to think about, okay, maybe I need to dress differently, maybe I need to act differently in order to prevent myself from sexual harassment. It's actually for that perpetrator to not sexually harass someone, right? So that is what we need to focus on, not the survivor. So when someone comes up to you and says that they have been sexually harassed or assaulted, the question shouldn't be, what were you doing, or what were you wearing, where did you go, were you drinking, that sort of thing. But the question should actually be, how are you? How can I help? Or sometimes people just need to be, you just need to listen. And the thing is, victim blaming is also one of the reasons why survivors don't speak up. Because usually when you go through sexual harassment, or even similar, sexual assault incidents or whatever, the first thing that survivors usually do is actually that they will question themselves first, right? And there's always this fear that, like, if I speak up, these are the things that are going to happen. There are some repercussions that will face me, especially if you are speaking against someone who is in power or who has authority, right? So if you, it's really not easy, and it's very challenging for someone to say, this really this CEO or this really famous person has actually actually sexually harassed me. Because people will then say, are you sure? Like, are you talking about this person? Cannot be, this person is not like that. And that's something that we really need to unlearn. We really need to move away from trying to question complainants, but rather to believe them. And even if you find it hard to believe, or you think, you know what, I don't know much about the case, I can't really say, fine, stay away from it. But that does not give you a license to say that this person is overreacting, that this person is imagining things, like how we heard in the video when in the beginning. And it is really not your place to say, okay, well, you should have done this or you should have done that. So the key thing here is that we want people to speak up freely and safely, and without fearing any repercussions on them. And we want to encourage people to speak up, because things are happening, and we've seen this, right? It's not just something that is new. It's not suddenly become popular, or it's not something that is suddenly more frequent recently. It's just that there's a lot more attention because of the Me Too campaign, social media, and people are becoming more and more aware of what's happening. But it's really not a new issue. It has been going on for centuries, right? And I think it is really time for us to start looking at things, slightly differently, and try to provide more support for complainants and future complainants to speak up. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Danny. Yeah, I really agree with you. Okay, guys. So here comes our Q&A session. So, I see there are a few questions coming in from the flow. So let's start our Q&A session today. So our first question. Our first question is it possible for sexual harassment to be happen in an intimate or romantic relationship between couple in short? And how do we educate people in dealing with this issue so that they can have a comfortable relationship between each other even though they are couple? So I'll let you guys to decide who want to answer this question.
Do you want to talk or go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Danny. I'm trying to understand the question first.
Sorry. If I'm not mistaken, okay, so let me just reiterate. I think the question is asking whether sexual harassment can happen in the context of an intimate relationship. Yeah. My view is yes. And the reason for that is because even if you are in an intimate relationship, it's not a license to treat each other without respect. Relationship, or actually even outside of it, relationship should be about respect, right? And when you say yes, to a relationship or to certain intimate acts within a relationship, that's not a one-time free for all sort of arrangement. And what that means is that consent can be withdrawn, and you can actually say no, right? That doesn't mean that if I am with you, then you are entitled to me and my body. I hope I answered the question. Is there a second part to the question, Lizin? What can a person do, is it?
What can we do to educate the people so then they can have a comfortable relationship between each other even though they are a couple? Right.
Yeah. So I think this boils down to communication. And like I said, respect is really a key factor here. If you feel that in your relationship it's very hard to get respect from your partner, then that's something that you really need to think of. If you can, and if you're comfortable talking about it, then you need to. And between the two of you, you need to understand that, like, look, I'm in this relationship. I'm not selling my soul to you. I'm not selling my body to you, and you don't own me, and I don't own you. I think there needs to be this honest communication about what is okay and what is not okay between parties in a relationship. And to understand that if I don't want to engage in certain acts, I don't have to. And that does not mean that I love you less or I like you less, right? And you are entitled to do that.
I just want to add what Danny has said exactly, also because, you may give, between two partners, you may agree to certain acts of intimacy privately or publicly. You don't want certain acts to be open in the space. And that is, as Daddy said, it's a communication. I wouldn't want to be, as a student or young into a relationship, to be, I sometimes don't like openly kissing, and you don't want that in the public sphere. So you keep telling your partner, I don't want this. You just have to say what you feel, so that there are boundaries are drawn. Certain boundaries, whether it's intimate or in public, you need to communicate that. I think that is key. And raising awareness about it, like having today's discussion, one webinar, I think it's important, so that more and more of us should talk about it, not just in the webinar, but in casual settings, like when you're having drinks with your friends, and when there are boys and girls around, have a casual discussion. And I think that is a very enriching discussion to raise awareness, and not just here on a webinar.
Thank you so much. I totally agree with your answer. So let's move on to the next question, since we have a lot of questions coming in. So the second question is like, what happens if there are no witnesses to a claim of sexual harassment?
Okay, shall I?
Yes.
I think because there's a lot to be discussed on sexual harassment, what to do. I think the key thing is in the audio that we saw, I don't think there was any witnesses when she was being harassed. It is important to document everything. For example, if you receive an email, document it. Or what happened to you that day he touched you, document it immediately. If you receive pictures, pornographic pictures, keep that. Don't destroy them, because you never know one day when you might use it. And have a chronology of the documentation, so that can be used as evidence if you want to, during the process of when you lodge a complaint internally, or police report, or take a civil suit. So I think that is important, documenting it. Perhaps if you had spoken to someone about the incident, although no one has witnessed it,
Yeah.
I think we lost her for a while.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mira. I think, we'll proceed to the next question. Yeah. Is that okay, Denny?
Sure. I just want to add, I think Mira got disconnected there. So adding on to what Mira said, even if there are no witnesses, there's no physical evidence or no emails, no text, whatever, the people that you spoke to can become your witness and assist. Sorry, Mira, I think we lost you for a while.
Yeah, I think so too. Lost in the process. It's okay. Carry on, Danny.
I think that's it. I just added on that the people that you speak to could also be witnesses when it comes to investigation. That's all.
Okay, thank you. The third question, what can we do if the family members are the ones who sexually harass the victim?
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jenny. It's okay.
Okay. Well, it's the same, right? I mean, whether or not it's a family member, if it's wrong, it's wrong. And in the past, we have worked with people who were not just sexually harassed, but raped and sodomized by a family member, and that's always very painful. The problem with having a family member do that is that you have to deal with that. There's a bit of a complexity that I have to admit. There's a bit of a complexity when it comes to family relationships, right? And I think the important thing is that you need to find help. You need to find someone who will support you. You need to find someone who you can trust. The processes are the same. If you feel that you want to lodge a report and you're comfortable doing that, go ahead. You can. And there's no distinction, whoever that perpetrator is.
I think you can also go under domestic violence, psychological violence. You could, because within the family setting, so you could apply for an interim protection order, because if it's under family setting, like a brother harassed sexually.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Sorry. Is it possible, maybe if you don't mind, Lizin, then maybe I can share a bit about what you can do as a survivor. This applies regardless of whether the alleged perpetrator is a family member or not, right? So one of the first things that I would suggest that you do is to actually document all this, right? Now, if this is happening at the time, like let's say you are at the office or something, and someone is saying something to you, and if it's practical for you to do so, then you can ask the perpetrator to stop. If not, and this is in most cases actually you can't, because there's always this fear, right? Then you need to speak to someone that you trust. So that can be a family member, that can be a friend, that can be someone who is maybe working in an NGO, or even someone else, right? Lodge a complaint, and in your complaint you need to detail the incident, from the who, the what, the where, the how, and all this needs to be documented properly and needs to be recorded, because you will have to go through this again and again, and you will be questioned on this, right? So you need to know the date and the time, the name of the alleged perpetrator, and you need to find witnesses. So like I was saying earlier, even if there were no eyewitnesses, as in people who were there during the incident, you can also speak to, you can also ask people that you spoke to afterwards, right? And the people that you sort of confided in, those people can also assist in providing evidence as to your mental state at the time, for example. You need to keep all evidence of the incident. Like Mira said earlier, any documents, any emails, SMSs, pictures, or anything like that. And the most important thing that I think people don't, usually talk enough about is to seek emotional support. And there are organizations that you can call, or even if it's not external, you can even find someone that you are close with, right? You need to speak to someone, because it really, if you bottle it up, it will actually eat you up inside. So I would really suggest that you open up and speak to someone that you trust about the incident and try to heal. So I
And
hope that
also,
helps.
yeah, I think sometimes you think you're all alone. You're the only one who may have been harassed by this particular person. And sometimes if you speak to another and that person said, hey, it happened to me. So you never know when you do speak to people around what this person would have done before.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. I think that is some like crucial information, but actually there are more questions coming, but we don't have more time to continue, so let's finish this. Okay, so our Q&A session will end here. And once again, I really appreciate Mira and Danny for sharing with us, and I hope we can continue to collaborate in the future. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and I hope you all have a fruitful session, better understanding on what is sexual harassment. And once again, a gentle reminder for all, our live today is being recorded, so in case if anyone miss out any details from this live, you can always check out on our YouTube or FB for the recorded videos. And thank you so much everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.